Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
And we've been away for a couple of weeks. We've had a little break.
We have.
And I feel re-energised.
Well, just as I'm about to go away, so...
Yeah, you're going away for a few days, aren't you, to lovely Vienna?
That's right.
So the film we've come back after our little break with is They Shall Not Grow Old.
Yes. It's Peter Jackson's new film, and there's been a lot of controversy around it because it's about the First World War. It's taken from archival footage, particularly a film called The Battle of the Somme, I think from 1916. And basically, it's been colorized. And it's not only been colorized, but it's kind of so you have these shots, let's say, of a group of soldiers, and what Jackson has done is he's also kind of made close-ups of what was a group shot, right? And all of this is set to interviews with veterans of the battle. So, there are all these oral histories or all these oral accounts are woven in together. And also, there's a lip-reading element. So I suppose actors have been hired to give voice to what lip readers see or detect that the people in the film say.
Yeah.
Right? So the film is made up of all of these various components, all of which have been deemed to be very controversial.
Yeah. So the film was commissioned by 14 to 18 Now and the Imperial War Museums. 14 to 18 Now is a UK government sort of initiative to commemorate the First World War because it's the centenary. I think it's kind of become blended a little bit with the IWM. I'm not sure exactly, but that's been the impetus of the film. And then all of these interviews, I counted actually at the end. They give you the names of every person whose voice makes an appearance in the film. There are 114 of them.
Gosh.
Primarily British, obviously. I counted 3 Australians, 2 Canadians, and a French amongst them.
Right.
But it's primarily British and actually particularly English stories that are being told. And these are interviews that, as far as I'm aware, were not commissioned. They were not done for the film. I think these are pre-existing.
No, these are pre-existing
from the BBC and IWM.
They're in archives, but as you can see, there's a credit note where he thanks the oral historians who actually went to speak to all of these different people to kind of keep a record of their experiences.
Yeah. So actually, it kind of struck me that not only is the footage archival, or at least based on archival, and then we can talk about what's been done to it, but also the interviews kind of are as well, which I thought was kind of interesting. So the film, I mean, you can't spoil it. We won.
Though not on your own.
So what the film does, rather than, I mean, if you wanted to tell sort of in-depth story of the war, it would take more than an hour and a half, 2-hour film. I don't know exactly how long it is. That's not what the film is attempting to do. And actually, it's funny because there was some talk beforehand, I think, between us and a couple of people that we know about the idea of it being the First World War generally is told as a lions led by donkeys story. And there's very much this thing. It's saying that if you've seen the 4 series of Blackadder, for instance, like so much of the comedy in that series came out of this idea of that these kind of good, honest, salt of the earth people in the trenches were being led by these buffoons who didn't know what, who didn't make all the wrong decisions or whatever it might be, didn't care. That's not what this film is doing, which I guess was kind of a pleasant surprise. I kind of expected that it might do. What actually it does is ignore that, really, and it just tries to portray through these memories and through this footage what the experience in quite general terms of your not average, because actually it's a story of their memories of lots of different people, so it's kind of there's a kind of general atmosphere of what the war felt like to the people who were sent to fight in it.
Yes.
Actually not sent, I mean they were sent, but wanted to fight in it.
Yes.
One of the first things, this really struck me, one of the first things that you see in the film, because it essentially goes in chronological order, although it doesn't hit kind of points of like the Battle of the Somme, whatever, but it just basically goes from, pre-war, the war, and then post-war.
Yes.
Very generally. And so you start off pre-war, and what these veterans are talking about a lot is wanting to go to war. There's a huge section which is about, I was 15 and you had to be 19, and so I told them I was 18, and they let me in. And the idea that although these kids were lying to get into the army and go to war, the powers that be absolutely knew that. It wasn't like they were being fooled. They knew that these kids were 15 and 16 years old, and they said, just say that you're 19 and we'll let you in. And it was this thing, it was this drive to you wanted to fight for your country. It was for king and country.
There is an element of coercion as well, though. So one of the famous things about World War One is, I don't know what they were called, but here I don't know the name for them, but it was kind of like a national phenomenon where women would gather together and give white feathers to men who they thought should be at the war and shame them through cowardice. So they basically kind of, I don't know whether they were called white feather girls or so on or whatever, but actually there is a story that tells an experience of that, of a guy walking through Camden and being accosted by these women and basically being called a coward and finding white feathers on his clothing. So it wasn't just hurrah, well, let's go. Yeah, kind of. And actually I think that's one of the nice things about the film, that through this weaving of different voices together into this footage, it does become kind of like a tapestry in a way, right? So the focus is on individual experience, but actually through the weaving together you get a collective experience as individual experience, or individual experience as collective experience, the other way around. But I thought that was one of the really lovely things about the film, actually.
It's something that I liked, and I think actually the film, although it helps the film to kind of build a case in a way, because you have, instead of one or two people saying something, you have maybe 20 people saying something, and that they're all saying ultimately the same sort of thing. We wanted to go. In fact, it's probably more than 20 at that point in the film. There's an awful lot of people telling these stories.
The majority of people wanted to go. I think I only remember one incident of someone being accosted and made to feel a coward.
But then there is also that aspect which I think you kind of hinted at there, which is that these stories, although they are stories being told by these veterans, may hide another aspect to it. These stories basically all point in one direction, which is that we all wanted to go, and it was the thing you wanted to do. And they talk about, I wanted to have a scrap with Jerry and that sort of thing. But maybe they do hide this other thing that's not being told in the film of, and if you didn't go, that was shameful. Or maybe I didn't really want to go, but I was, as you say, sort of coerced into it. So the film does tell a particular. It shapes the story.
Well, I mean, I think this is something that maybe we should bring out even more when we talk about what we perceive the problems of the film to be, because I think there's no question that a story is shaped for us by Jackson, right? Yeah. I mean, this isn't like any kind of document of the truth of the war or anything. It's a kind of a particular iteration of it, a particular version of it that's kind of, visualized, shaped, and given voice to by Jackson. I personally think it's very successful in doing so. But there's no question that it is an individual's perspective. It's dedicated to his grandfather.
Who fought in the
war. I don't know who the other two people specifically
I'm not sure. One of them had New Zealand in his...
Right.
in his title, right? So they may have been relatives as well.
Yes. So I actually do think that it's kind of quite an extraordinary achievement, actually.
Really?
Yes, and I was moved.
I must say I wasn't moved, but maybe that's neither here nor there. I'm not sure the film's project is necessarily to move you. It is to portray, though, this experience, and I think that's what it's very successful at. That's what I kind of got the feeling of.
Yes.
or the the memories of this experience. I mean, so there is this aspect which I guess we should come on to of the film is built out of this archival footage.
Yes.
And kind of newsreel footage and so on that was shot in training camps and in the trenches, that has been colorized, sharpened, transformed into 3D, which we didn't see it in 3D.
No, we didn't.
We saw it the electric, and that's just not what it wasn't being shown in 3D there. It's been cropped a little bit like kind of Ken Burns, where it's just sort of just parts of the image are taken, or you move from one part of the image to the other. It's been interpolated, so frames have been interpolated to, take footage that was at some points kind of 10 or 11 frames a second and turn it into, kind of emulate what it would have looked like maybe at 20 frames a second. And I think that is not successful. And actually I had a real problem with it. Partly, and we can talk about the ideological sort of things and the ethical aspects behind it, but what's really surprised me about it was I was led to believe by everyone, all the promotional stuff and everyone talking about it in advance, saying this has become something really amazing, this footage, we've turned this into something really great. I thought it looked absolutely bloody awful.
Oh, I didn't think it looked awful, but I certainly think the amazingness was overstated. I mean, my initial thing, when it turned to color, is that all there is? And actually the footage that we had seen previously looked so good that I kind of felt it was a loss, actually, when it turned into color, right? So
I agree.
For me, that wow element was not there. But after a while, actually, the aspects of colorization I found interesting because it drew my attention to certain things that the black and white didn't.
Such as?
Such as the poppies. It gave a kind of a three-dimensionality to the trenches. That you could see spots of mud and so on. It drew your attention to the water, right? And so on. So I kind of it made it much easier to differentiate between Germans and Brits. So actually, I think that that there were things that I found very useful, to kind of to have had it colorized, right? So, but I must say, if what you're meant to go, oh wow, I didn't. The other thing, though, that I did think that the color brought out, and I think maybe this was more important than anything, is that it made each of the faces in the footage much more individual to me. It did bring them out. Kind of, for me, it was much easier to distinguish, amongst, so, you see, like, I don't know, some soldiers, and all of a sudden, when you colorize it, you see this person and that person and that person. It brings out differences that in the black and white, it was easier for me, at least, to ignore.
That's something that I think we should bring up Lawrence Napper at this point, who and I know a tiny little bit basically through you, who's written a couple of blogs and a review of this. He's been very, very active talking about it. And
we should post all of that, and Pamela Hutchinson's piece as well on the blog, on the podcast.
Yeah, we'll put links to that in the description and in our blog. So Lawrence's blog is called Out the Pictures, and he's written a couple of pieces there. And there's also a review on Silent London by Pamela Hutchinson. So we'll put links to those.
Yes.
But what you were just talking about in terms of the faces is something that Lawrence brought up in particular, which I just want to find in his blog. Here we are. So this is talking about where a lot of the historical footage comes from. Lawrence says, "We might think of the film footage as a historical object in and of itself. This material was shown widely in the UK during the war itself, both as short newsreel items and compiled into longer feature-length war actuality films such as The Battle of the Somme in 1916. Audiences at the time reported that these films precisely enabled them to feel close to their sons and husbands and to the experiences they were going through in the trenches. Roger Smith and others have pointed out the way in which the structure of those films encourage an attempt at recognition, the impulse to scan the screen for the face of your own loved one."
Yes.
And that's you can see those shots these are shots that are in They Shall Not Grow Old, right? These panoramic, the camera pans across, a bunch of soldiers sitting at a table having lunch, or just generally sitting around wherever it might be when they're not fighting, and it's there, I think, where you talk about the kind of the faces kind of really coming out, and I think Peter Jackson again said much the same, that the faces really pop. Actually, that's where I had problem with some of it, because that's where I felt what they've done to try and kind of upgrade the image. They've done an awful lot of sharpening and, as I say, kind of interpolation of frames that weren't originally there. And in doing so, that it leads to, like, the sharpening seems to have been so aggressive that the algorithm has been looking for edges that aren't there. So you get this kind of weird kind of, it's like the image has been sort of painted and then like stippled. So you get kind of light and dark in this very tight pattern that just sort of ruins the image basically, and yet it's somehow kind of flat. And this really happens on faces. Actually, it doesn't happen so much with like tanks and kind of military equipment, because that's all kind of straight lines and things. So those tend to look quite good, but faces are really ruined by this.
Well, I don't quite agree. I mean, so let's see if we're talking about the same thing, because on the one hand, I kind of agree with you, but you see, I think when he does that, what he does is he zooms in, on what is a group shot to extract a close-up out of that shot. And he's got to often kind of zoom in, to such an extent that what I saw was that the faces around the central image became distorted. There was a slight distortion, which was odd. But actually, I didn't feel that there was a distortion on the face itself, on the central close-up itself. And I like that. And actually, I don't have any ethical problems with it. One of the characteristics of, contemporary life is that we do this reassemblage all the time with all aspects of popular culture. So, my view is that as long as, the archival footage at the Imperial War Museum remains as is and remains available to anyone who wants to see it as is, then actually kind of, all these kind of different workings that Peter Jackson does is, kind of whatever he thinks he needs in order to kind of do his own narrative, or give his version, right, of this experience. And actually, I think it's perfectly fine. I was very glad to see, for example, that the room was full of people today, right?
It's packed, yeah.
So kind of its intent, which was, to get people to remember and to get people to go see it and to re-experience and to, hear what people said in their own words, or at least his version of what people said in their own words. I think in all of those respects, it's immensely successful.
I tend to agree. And actually, I have limited kind of ethical problems with it. And actually, I think the fact that the alterations to the footage and the additions have been so extensive actually means that you can't take it seriously as sort of authentic.
It's not true. It's not unvarnished or transparent truth,
right?
It is
exactly
kind of,
so the fact that, like, if only a little bit had been done, and they were like, well, this is super authentic, that would be actually, I think, more of a problem in a way than the fact they've done such an extensive series of changes to it. They've transformed it into something that I think is qualitatively different. I think you can't, if you were to take this as, like, there's a suggestion, I think, that it's going to be used as, it's intended for use in schools as teaching material.
I think that would be great.
And I think, that would be great as long as, as long as kind of part of the teaching is around the issues of the restoration.
Yes, but Lawrence in his own blog, I think some of the original footage is easily available on YouTube, right? So actually, I think that would make a great teaching thing. You can show the original, and then you could show the film. Actually, could bring up all kinds of problems of history and representation and so on.
Absolutely. But the point is that any conversation around this film has to include the nature of the film.
What I find troubling about all of the conversation around this film, and kind of it's the dictatorship of the image, because one of the things, as you mentioned, that was so interesting is the sheer number of voices, right, that we hear. Now, each aspect of those voices is like the equivalent of extracting a photograph from, a group shot, right? Because what they've done is they've taken, probably a sentence, or a word, or and actually out of that they've stitched these narratives of all of those different voices. They're never named as you hear them, right? They are meant to be individual voices because you hear the differences in accents and ways of speaking, but actually, you're never directed as to who is speaking. It's always like a soldier's
it's never
speaking,
no names come
right?
up or anything like that.
Nobody's complaining about that or the authenticity of that or kind of the historical ethics of doing that, which de facto you're erasing all of these people by unifying them into a voice, right? So I just think that's interesting. All of the problems that have been raised around the use of images, right? And of course, cinema is images and sounds, and nobody's giving a fuck about the sound.
Yeah, true. But it is also, I think that's an interesting point. But I think it's also true to say that while as you say the voices are just kind of played one after the other, and you're never given a hint as like who in particular is talking, they are all named at the end.
But you don't know who's talking when.
And so they're not assigned to particular voices,
yes.
but you are given all the names. But
the footage is also given credit.
It's given credit, but nonetheless, like there is a difference in the nature of what it is. So, like the voices, you could there is an interesting aspect, I think, in the fact that these are voices of people many years after the war ended, talking about their memories, and the idea that their memories may have kind of affected.
There are many things: the memories, the ideology through which they speak, and how that might have changed from 1913, 14 to like whenever they were recorded in maybe the 50s or 60s, right? Kind of, what we understand is shaped by access we have to ways of understanding. Yeah. So all of those things will have changed. None of them the film accounts for. It is all a problem in terms of establishing truth claims for the film. But I don't think it's necessarily a problem, to have an experience of the film based on, an artist kind of shaping that material in his own way.
I agree. Yeah. But just say the point I was trying to pick up on was that these voices, with the one or two things you can identify about, say the ideologies they may be speaking through, the memories maybe have been kind of rose tinted over the years or something like that. These are still their voices, whereas what's been done to the footage is very, very deliberate and actually has some kind of from Peter Jackson as director has a kind of editorial aspect to it, which is slightly different. Particularly, for instance, that sunset shot right at the end, where it actually that shot fades back into the black and white footage, and in the black and white footage there is no indication that there is a sunset going on at the time. That is a purely romanticized image.
Sure.
So that's the kind of difference I'm talking about, I guess.
Yes, and I get that, but again, I just personally, don't have a problem with it. I mean, I have, I do things sometimes where I take macho film stars like John Wayne or whatever, and I redraw lipstick on them or whatever, Now, that's a commentary, right? But it's kind of, and it's kind of my making a commentary on their image or whatever. It's my thing, I'm not saying that John Wayne was gay or anything, but, I want people to think about, So, I think what Peter Jackson is doing to me is, well, it's obviously different.
It would have been very brave if he put lipstick on this soldiers.
But,
I don't think there's any question. I guess this is the point. There is no question that the film is trying to show you, trying to convince you that of authenticity in this. I think that was a problem with the promotional material. I think seen absent from the promotional material, the film comes across as a point of view on the war and a way of trying to tell the story of the war that is not trying to kind of be monolithic or is not trying to take over from other points of view.
I haven't seen any of the publicity. So.
Well, the publicity was a real point of. I was talking to Lawrence about this quite a bit. The promotional stuff was really heavily trying to sell the point with Peter Jackson involvement in the trailers, like he's talking to an interviewer, of talking up how bad the original footage is. Basically talking about it being black and white, there being kind of scratches and dirt on the prints, that sort of thing. The odd frame rates, the idea of it being sped up footage, as if you couldn't just play it at the natural frame rate, and then talking about basically having to talk about how awful the source footage is to emphasize how great our contribution has been.
Yes. Okay, that's been established to be false.
Yeah.
There was a spanking new restored version or recently restored version available.
Yeah.
So.
And the title, I think, says that as well. The title, They Shall Not Grow Old, which comes from Lawrence Binyon. Is it Lawrence Binyon poem? Yeah, Lawrence Binyon's poem For the Fall. And actually, the original line is They Shall Grow Not Old. It's been changed to They Shall Not Grow Old. But that's from a war poem. But it's sort of like Peter Jackson saying, they shall not grow old because I have the technological means to keep them from being forgotten, to keep them young, which I really dislike. There is something about that title which I find very distasteful. That's the way it kind of feels to me.
Again,
there's a very deliberate reason.
I don't feel that way.
There's a very deliberate reason that title's been chosen, I think, and I think one of the reasons that the film is of such interest is that it's not just a film by Peter Jackson, who's an Oscar-winning director, about the First World War. It's that there's been a technological project going on here, and that is half the reason to see it, if not most of the reason.
Well, I think that's been oversold, right? Because what it does is to colorize films, or to inject 3D, onto archival footage. I mean, there's nothing, cutting edge about doing any of that.
Sure, but in terms of our actual experience of having just seen it, we would both agree that actually it's not that great a kind of difference and that we can cope with it.
Yeah.
But in terms of the way it's being talked about and promoted, that is the reason. That's the way it's being sold. I think part of the commission from the IWM was along the lines of, we went to Peter Jackson said, they came to me and said, what can you do with this? We want to show it in a way that it's not been seen before, that sort of thing.
Well,
and there was a lot of talk as well about it being about kids not being able to engage with black and white footage as if...
part of the disadvantage, really, about having read on this film before we see it, is that we're actually kind of talking about those things instead of talking about the film and our response to the film.
A little bit, but I think it's really important because I think the context around this is enormously important.
Well, I think it's no more important than in any other film, right? So, kind of the job of the publicity man is to sell you, a version of the film that they think will sell. On the other hand, kind of there is what you go and see the film as and your kind of experience of it. And, kind of you can ignore, their patter, you can ignore their shtick and just put it aside, I kind of, so what, how they want to sell you the film?
I mean, that's the thing, it's like our experience of the film has actually been much kind of lighter than that, and we took different things from it, and we'll continue to talk about it. There are a couple of things at least I want to talk about, but I just think that I think it's a point of interest that it's being sold and promoted as such. And like I say, I think the kind of central idea of it initially from the commission was that it would be this way of rejuvenating this imagery for younger generations who couldn't possibly cope with black and white footage in full frame.
I know. I was interested in kind of, again, in Lawrence saying, well, my students are proof that that's not the case. Because actually, my students are proof that it is the case. There is a resistance to watching black and white.
Okay.
I mean, I see it even with you. Much less kind of, students who are already 12 years younger than you. I think there is a barrier to watching black and white films amongst young people. There's no question about that. For me, So actually, I don't know whether, certainly I'm against colorization in principle, of movies, just because I think, part of the art that they have, if they're shot in black and white, the values that the black and white brings and the lighting and the cinematography and so on, it really matters. I kind of, I don't know, I think in a way, partly this is different, right? Because, it wasn't... the film was shot as a document, right? So actually, I suppose then there are things about you change the document by colorizing it, or you change its status as a document. I think those are all, I understand why those are all issues of concerns to historians. I think myself as a spectator, it's not a concern, and I think it did work on me, actually. When I saw the camera going through those faces and they came into color, There was a thing that all of a sudden they did seem more three-dimensional to me. They felt more individual, right? So if part of the process of giving names and faces, or faces at least, of individualizing the mass of people who gave up their lives in World War One, I think for me it succeeds.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about something slightly different then. Let's talk about Brexit.
In this context,
Yeah, it came to me. It occurred to me once or twice. Actually, it occurred to me very early on with the. I think I mentioned that with the idea of these young people being encouraged to go to war, and then whereas in the modern day, kind of the argument over whether 16 and 17-year-olds should have been allowed to vote for Brexit, so they can give their lives 100 years ago, but they can't give their vote today.
No, I think that's disgraceful.
Occurred to me.
Yes.
But also, what then occurred to me, I was kind of thinking generally about Brexit in terms of, is this a film aimed at, like, who is this aimed at, and who would be likely to like it? I remember when we watched Darkest Hour, we came out of that basically saying, like, this is a film for people who voted for Brexit in a way. Yes. I thought, is this the same sort of thing? Now, I'm not sure that it is.
No, I don't think so.
And one thing that I really picked up on was... When you're being shown before the war, the voices are talking about wanting to go over there and fight Jerry. You know, we didn't like the Germans. We wanted to go over there and beat them. And there's no talk about kind of what the overarching reasons behind the war might have been. There's no talk about the politics or anything like that. That's all for the higher brass. No one talks about that. People just talk about, I wanted to go and get involved in the fight. And then later on, really towards the end of the film, you start to see Germans in the footage. They're being taken prisoners of war. And you hear the people, the veterans talking about them, and you see footage of the sort of, sometimes they're kind of sitting together, they're kind of getting on, they're swapping hats, and what the people are talking about, what the voices are remembering, is that we found out that these people were a lot like us. A lot of them just kids like us, of the same sort of ages,
much thinner, less well fed, less well provisioned.
And, you know, one guy talking about this guy was a barber. Another guy says the guy I was talking to spoke a bit of English and told me that he was a waiter at the Savoy.
The Savoy, yes.
So what that made me think about was the idea of hating these other people until you get to know them.
Yes.
You know? And the idea that kind of speaks to the idea that a lot of regions that voted more heavily for Brexit in the UK were places that had lower immigrant populations. That you know, it's that kind of idea of, you know, I hate all these people except for the guy who lives next door to me. He's fine.
Yes,
that sort of thing.
I don't know. I mean, I had to see what I also liked very much about the use of those voices is, you know, you had the British soldiers saying, "Oh, the Bavarians were lovely," you know, and kind of, you know. And the Saxons weren't too bad, and the Württembergians, you know, but those Prussians were so nasty, or right, like you know, that kind of, they had a collective experience that kind of made just these regional differences about the Germans. That, you know, the Germans were no longer just the Hun or whatever, right? That, you know, there were like, yeah, not only differences amongst individuals, but actually differences amongst the regions of Germany. Right?
Yeah,
you know, I thought that was very interesting. I still think, or, you know, in relation to kind of the Brexit argument, and I think it's kind of interesting because, of course, Peter Jackson is a New Zealander. I still don't like how little any of these films speak to a collective experience of empire. I mean, you know, I wonder how my friends in Canada, for example, will react to this. You know, because as you said at the beginning, it still gives the impression, you know, that World War One, you know, was fought mainly by English people. You know, you could include a few Scots. The kilts come out, you know, occasionally when you need some kind of visual movement within the frame. You know, but actually that it was the whole empire that, you know, was not given much. You do see a Sikh regiment actually, you know, once, right?
The film is shaping an English story out of a worldwide.
So actually, I think to me that there would be problems, you know, around that, right? Because, you know, each of those battalions, as far as I understand, kind of, or each of these regiments, you know, they were all kind of led by kind of the, you know, the forces of the British Empire, right? It wasn't just like England fighting World War One. So kind of all of those erasures of Australians and New Zealanders and Indians and, you know, kind of South Africans and all of those kind of different people that really had no call to bloody come and fight World War One, except, you know, that everyone was part of the British Empire, and then you fought for the the motherland was the British Empire, and then it's as if all of it is always being done by England. I think there's something Brexity about that. Yeah, we did it alone. We can do it alone. We can go it alone. When actually, that to me is the biggest historical untruth about all of these films, The Darkest Hour, and and so on. So but that could just be me. But I felt that.
No, I was thinking along those lines as well, and I was thinking particularly kind of what you would make of it in a way. I guess.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, when we went to northern France and Belgium. Was it last year or 2 years ago?
I think 2 years ago now.
And we're looking at kind of the war graves. It's all that was the kind of theatre of World War One.
Yes, we saw the trenches, and we walked through them.
Saw an awful lot of trenches and war cemeteries and things like that. And actually, I forget exactly where the region was, but there's one region that we went to where there's an awful lot of Canadian remembrance.
Yes.
Which you were pleased by.
Yes.
And rightly so.
Well, that documents kind of those historical acts in a way that are blatantly excluded from this film. I think there's one mention, about how the Canadians gambled with more money or something.
Yeah, that's right.
That's it.
Yeah, the Canadians and Australians, when they gambled, they spent vast sums that the English, these poor old Yorkshire sort of people in poverty had never seen the likes.
Yeah, so it's like they didn't give up their lives; they were just, they're fatter and richer playing cards.
So, I mean, it's a tough one. Like, I would like to know kind of how editorial it's been on Jackson's part in a way. Like these, as I say, these kind of 114 voices are almost all English, and you wonder how many people of other nationalities could have been included and weren't from the archive of tapes.
I think I think that's probably an issue, right? I mean, these oral histories, were probably all conducted in England, right?
How much was the commission of the film to do with telling an English-centric story? That sort of thing.
It is the Imperial War Museum.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And also, I imagine that someone with maybe a bit more imagination would have at least kind of looked and seen if there were equivalent oral histories in Australia, in Canada, maybe in India or South Africa. I mean, I'd be pretty sure that, such things could be found, in Canada. Yeah, conversations with World War I vets. So I don't know. Anyway, I don't want to belabor this point too much.
The other thing about it is that the film is putting together an experience of the war as experienced by largely kind of poorer and, from the sounds of it, younger English people, English men, who went to fight. And so I wonder if the kind of differences that might be brought out by people of different nationalities within the empire talking about their experience of fighting for it might have forced the film down a different route that they didn't want to go down, that sort of thing.
Maybe.
I don't know.
I mean, I don't know, right? It remains speculative. We can only deal with what is there. Actually, I think an interview with Jackson about, how they made the choices that they did would be an interesting thing to do, if it could be done. But, right now it's all speculative. What I do find interesting, though, is that it becomes another example of everything kind of being reduced to an English experience.
Yeah. I think you have to keep it in your head, because if you keep it in your mind that this was an imperial effort, then it's very clear that there is exclusion of those experiences within the film.
That's
and
right.
the film is trying to tell you a story of what English blokes kind of experienced the war as. So it's not to say that's kind of no value or anything. Of course it's not. And it's an interesting film, and it's an interesting kind of set of experiences to hear. But it is an exclusion that you have to be aware of.
Yes, and I think it's particularly important for historians to be aware of it, because you can understand the bloke on the street saying, oh, my grandfather fought in the war, and, having that my great-grandfather, and having that particular experience of it. But I think it's kind of interesting how often, historians reduce, war effort to a small England version of what it was. I mean, often not even taking the UK on board, right? Like, much less kind of a consideration that, in fact, the British Empire was very active, that its forces and goods were provided in huge numbers, right? And that kind of, just the same way that those Jamaicans in Windrush didn't need a British passport because they were British, right? Kind of, a more expanded notion of these discussions of World War One, right? And a more inclusive one, and a kind of, just because the relations now are different, it doesn't mean that in 1919 or 1939, they're the same as now,
Yeah, and I guess this how to put it, there is something anodyne about the film in that it has no interest in making a question of any of that.
There's a wonderful philosopher, Canadian philosopher called Harold Innes, who's got this thing called Empire and Communications, where he says, the thing about empire is that they don't need to know anything about anybody else, right? Because they're the center of power and commerce and money and trade and and armies. Right. Whereas actually, if you live on the periphery, if you live in the colony, right, then you have to know everything about empire. Because actually, if you don't know everything about empire as well as your own culture, you can't survive. You can't do business. So that there's always like this mismatch in communication. And actually, the interesting thing about Brexit is that kind of I think people still have the attitudes that go along with empire, but actually with neither the financial, military, or diplomatic power that goes along with it, right? So there's still the sense you don't need to know about anything else, really, because you are the center of it. And actually, you're no longer the center, and you do need to know about anything. And actually, I think the way that a film like this interprets that history in a kind of a narrowly local way, right, is to me part of the problem. Even though it's done by a fucking New Zealander.
Yeah. I think actually you can I think you can generalize that idea in a way. Like, it's not just about empire, and it's about any kind of kind of difference in power and hegemony. Like if you're a man, you don't really need to know anything about women because you can get along just fine without knowing it. Whereas if you're a woman, you need to know everything about guys.
About
if
power.
You're black, you need to know everything about white people. If you're white, you don't need to care about other races.
I think
it can be generalized.
Yes. I think it can, and it is about power. You can, reduce it to power relations, really.
Yeah.
So anyway.
And so ultimately, like, the point then is that in this film, like, it does nothing to question or even bring up any of that. It is just, it's English through and through, and and if you're English, you get to not think about it.
But let's also, I did find the film moving, right? So let's kind of move a little bit to what I think are the film's achievements. I really found it moving. I found it moving, for many reasons, right? Kind of, people's attitude. You also get a sense of how impoverished their lives were and how few options they came into the army with, right? One of them says, "I like to be told what to do," right? Like, kind of, so, there are people with little options, and, kind of, then basically they just did what they were told in the army. And the big shock, of course, was not so much what happened during the war, though, you're told how terrible every moment of that was and what they saw and what they experienced. But actually, the most heartfelt hurt seems to be what happened when they came back. And that nobody cared.
No one cared.
Yeah. So I think that's what I get out of it. And actually, I think that was true then, and it's true now, right? It's all rah-rah going into the war, and it's always war vets begging for money, homeless, without a limb when they return, right? So this idea that, nations pay lip service to their vets and thank you for your service, but then fuck off, and get your own wheelchair.
Yeah. Oh, it really, really made me think of the whole "thank you for your service" thing you get in America,
Yes.
which is kind of creeping in over here bit by bit. But it's not nearly like it's a real cult over there.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a military junta basically in the
Yes.
United States. But it really made me think of that. Like it's all about the lip service and about kind of showing deference and. When you see someone in military uniform, you talk to them and you say, "Well, thank you for your service," and that and the other. To the point where, a lot of members of the military don't really like it very much. A lot of them actually haven't seen any conflict. So
Yes.
so then to be told in the queue at KFC, "Thank you for your service," is like, I haven't done anything. Sorry.
Yes. Well, and also thank you for your service also implies that people have options, and often what you see, I mean, in a lot of documentaries or, social history that's being written about America at the moment, is that people have no options. There's no jobs, really. So you join the army or you're on welfare, really.
Well, you join the army because that gets you your healthcare, or it gets you your pension, or it gets you whatever.
Exactly.
And it's
right?
actually...
So you have to risk your life.
The country
to get
gives you no
healthcare.
options to force you into the army.
Yeah, and there are no jobs. I think that's important as well. So this thank you for your service when I don't have a fucking option, but to risk my life for a bit of healthcare is, and actually I think it's creepy that the ideology behind that isn't kind of constantly underlined, right? That kind of, it's how effective the mass media is and so on, and kind of discourses that shape people's thought, because to even question that in the current climate, you're made to think you're unpatriotic or anti-American or, just speaking an obvious, or what seems to me an obvious truth. It's somehow thought to be anti-American, But anyway, we must return to the film and perhaps wrap it up.
Well, ultimately, I guess I'd say, we had a whole conversation about the ethics behind what was done to the footage and the ideas and all that sort of thing. Which is all kind of perfectly valid to have, but I think ultimately it is a pretty successful portrait of an experience or set of experiences of the First World War.
Yes.
Which I think is kind of valuable.
I think the film is very successful at, both individualizing and through kind of knitting together those individual voices and faces and images to kind of give a sense of a collective experience that is shared. And I did find, that it worked on me, kind of both emotionally and actually just in giving you lots of things to think about.
Yeah.
So go see it.
Yeah, it's worth it. I think it's going to be shown on the BBC.
Ah, okay, then tune in.
Let me see if I can find a source for that. I think I heard that. When will it air on BBC One? I'm afraid I'll put the Sun website into your history.
That's all right.
Yes, it's planned to be aired on Armistice Day, November the 11th.
Well, voila.
Apparently, BBC One Armistice Day is going to be shown, so and it will be worth watching.
Yes, I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much. We're eavesdropping at the movies, and we're
Facebook, iTunes, SoundCloud, Twitter, eavesdroppingatthemovies.com, and YouTube.
Right. Thank you very much for listening.
Bye bye.